We'll be addressing prison gerrymandering, the prison industrial complex, and the census. I'm Jerica Richardson, and I serve as the Senior Vice President for Equitable Justice and Strategic Initiatives. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to the President and CEO of the National Urban League, Mark Morial. Mark, you're muted.
Hey, thanks, Jerica. Thank you for your leadership. Thank you for the generous introduction. And let me thank all of you who joined the Black Census Roundtable today. We appreciate your work over the last several years to ensure that the count we do and the information gathered is both complete, accurate, and fair, and that Black communities and other historically marginalized communities are completely involved in the design of the census, in the execution of the census, and in the count for the census. Today's issue is an issue we have been fighting on for a very long time, and it's prison gerrymandering. And it is an issue where I felt like we got close to major change in 2016, when there was an active proposal at Census to change the way those who are incarcerated are counted, to count them at their home address, where they permanently reside, where they are domiciled, if you will, versus counting them where they, in many instances, are temporarily residing while they are under court orders of incarceration. We got close, and then the 2016 election took place. And think about how now 16 to 23 is 7 years. How we lost 7 years of effort and momentum, and we're right back to where we are. Those of you who are on this call do not need to be convinced of the merits of this issue. I will say this. This is an issue which is a civil rights issue, a human rights issue, a voting rights issue, an issue of fairness, and an issue of equity, because what it does is it disproportionately advantages, in many instances, small parishes in Louisiana, small counties in the other 49 states, to have population counts which are greater than they should, and which inures to the benefit of those communities under many formula funding programs. The converse is also true. And that is, in those communities where many of these folks are actually domiciled, they are disadvantaged because they're not counted in the distribution of these formula funding programs. So it impacts more than the people that we're discussing today. It impacts this whole issue of balance. So I am prepared, like all of you all are, to continue this push for change when it comes to this issue. We have to continue to work and to fight. And I think we can accomplish and achieve this. Now is the time. We cannot wait until just before the count begins. We're almost mid-decade, if you can believe it. 2023, before we know it, 2025 will be here. So I'm thankful to all of you. I'm thankful to our team at the National Urban League, Jerica Richardson, of our EJSI team, the leader of that team, Jerry Green, who has been an advisor to us on census issues for many, many years, Ihioma Aruka, who is relatively new to the team, but has brought a level of passion and expertise to this discussion. I'm very thankful for them, because this issue can be nuanced, complicated, and challenging to follow from a policymaking point of view. And I also want to thank my co-convener, my colleague, my sister. Want to congratulate her once again for her years of service and for the recent dedication of the new Thomas Dortch initiative down in Atlanta, Georgia. She's none other than Melanie Campbell. And with that, I am going to yield the floor to my sister and co-convener of this roundtable effort, Melanie Campbell. Melanie?
Hi, thank you, Mark. And it's always good to be here. Thank you. Good to see everyone. And thank you, Mark, for taking on an additional job with no pay, serving as our chair of the National Coalition. So y'all just got a sneak peek. We haven't put that out publicly yet. I want to thank your team, of course, for always being on point. And thank you for taking the lead for us being able to partner with you on the recent OMB conversations on race and ethnicity standards that you all convened, and to sign on with that letter that was comments that were submitted. This issue, and thank you also, Mark, not just for that, but thank you for also serving as a co-host for our launch of our National Coalition's Thomas W. Dortch Jr. Institute. But we also had our Southern organizing convening and having a representation there from the Urban League, because one of the things that was really focused for us is around saving our democracy, and also dealing with issues of rights and freedoms, and how the census plays out. We all know has a lot to do with power or lack of resources, and the reality that when we're not counted, our population is not counted in the proper place, we end up with that undercount, and how that affects us in so many ways, from a representation standpoint, from an economic standpoint, and other ways of not being counted properly. And the prison gerrymandering, and you brought it to the point. We were on our way, Jerry. You know, we were on our way, and things shift, and elections matter in regards to that. So I'm really looking forward, and then also want to welcome a new partner that you brought on, Mark, Black Male Voter Project, who's joined the roundtable. So looking forward to the conversation today, and thanks again to Urban League and team and everyone that's a part of this coalition. And I know we can, I'm just glad we're working with the clock that Jerry's been marked and telling us we have to work, and that's 10 years. It's a 10-year process that has to stay. And so I think it's really important what we're doing here today. So thanks so much. And thank you, my team that's on the call too.
Thank you very much, Melanie. We're going to go to Reverend Patrick Young.
Thank you, Mark, and appreciate you and the leadership you've given to us over 20 plus years, perhaps. Congratulations. Let us pray. God, we thank you for the privilege to serve you and serve your people. We ask now your blessing, your guidance and direction as we move, facilitate a spirit of strength and a spirit of development and change for our communities and for those who are now voiceless and helpless in our communities. Help us, oh God, sustain us and strengthen us and guide us by your spirit, we pray. Amen.
Thank you. Before moving to the next speaker, let me also welcome a new National Roundtable member, Black Male Voter Project, led by Mondale Robinson. Welcome, Mondale. Thank you for your leadership. Thank you for being a part of this National Census Black Roundtable convening. Thank you very much. And thank you, Reverend Young. Let's go to Fred McBride with the Southern Poverty Law Center. He is a senior advisor for voting rights. Fred, thank you for joining.
Thank you for having me, and it's my pleasure to be here with you all today. First of all, glad to be here. Glad to be working on this issue, as I've been involved in this for a while now. We all know the importance of redistricting and how prison gerrymandering affects our ability to elect candidates of choice. With all of the attacks against the Voting Rights Act and Section 5, as we know, the Shelby 10th anniversary is this year. With all of that, we oftentimes think it can't get worse, but this is something that's been an undercurrent and it's been around for a while, and it's counting incarcerated individuals in areas where we know they won't reside once they are released, and that is affecting the ability for many metropolitan areas inundated with high concentrations of people of color and such, losing out on representation and funds. So I'm glad that we're addressing this issue today, and I look forward to speaking and answering questions during my time. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you very much. Appreciate your leadership and all of the incredible work that the Southern Poverty Law Center does. You all have been a research partner of NUL on the state of Black America and still provide, I think, the most important research on a range of issues. So thank you very much, Fred. We're going to go to Alex Katsura, the legal director for the Prison Policy Initiative. And pardon me if I did not pronounce your name correctly. Please pardon me. But let's go to Alex.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, it's as good as it gets. So yeah, I've been working on addressing prison gerrymandering for over 10 years. And as Fred mentioned, it's been an undercurrent, and that's not only metaphorical, but quite literal, because prison gerrymandering starts with the data. So it allows this kind of bias in the data where you're counting people in the wrong place, and then redistricting bodies can just place every other gerrymandering tool at their disposal on top of that. So it allows them to push gerrymandering and distort political representation way past constitutionally permissible limits. And yeah, it impacts legislative priorities, not only in the districts that are affected, but oftentimes it links areas of states that have high concentrations of prison locations together in ways that forms voting blocks within the legislature that those areas wouldn't normally have much in common. But because of the prison gerrymandering that goes on, you have these artificial blocks of power within the legislators that shift political priorities across the state.
Did we lose sound? Hello?
No, we're here. Can you hear us, Mark?
Oh, Alec, are you finished?
The end.
Okay, thank you. So next we go to the Senior Counsel for Voting Rights with the Southern Coalition for Social Justice, Hillary Klein.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for having me and including me today. It's such a privilege and a pleasure to be here. I'm with the Southern Coalition for Social Justice. If you haven't heard about us, we advocate in the South for the social, political, and economic rights of traditionally marginalized and disenfranchised communities. That often is in the courtroom in redistricting matters. We're litigating 5 or 6 redistricting matters currently. At the Southern Coalition, we view the end of prison gerrymandering as absolutely quintessential to an abolition agenda. We need to relegate this practice, along with all discriminatory practices in our election systems, absolutely to the past, and move into a better future where all people have equal protection under the law and equal access to the ballot, where their votes count equally without any distortion from these horrible and morally abhorrent practices that can be traced all the way back to discriminatory practices from our country's founding. So in 2021, we teamed up with Alex's group, PPI, to work with 14 grassroots organizations in 7 states across the South. We contacted over 240 jurisdictions advocating for an end to prison gerrymandering. And I'm really glad to be here to maybe share some learning that we got out of that experience.
Thank you very much. I'm going to turn it over now to the wonderful and incomparable Jerry Green, who is going to take it from here and moderate a more complete discussion. And I'll say, from the Black Census Roundtable perspective, This is one of our highest priorities. And from this understanding, we want to collectively elevate the heat through elevating the light and really try to push while we have an administration committed to equity. We have got to make this a high priority, not only amongst those of us on this discussion today, but with broader community, members of Congress, local electeds across the board. So let me turn it over to Jerry. And good to see you, Eric Brown. Appreciate your leadership and the leadership of any other affiliate leader who's on. Thank you for taking time to be with us today. Jerry Green, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Mark. It's so nice being here. As we know, Ioma wanted to be here, but she has a major milestone with her 6-year-old moving to the next level. So she's enjoying that as we do this work here. You all talked a little bit about putting this issue into historical context. So I'd like to add a little bit more. Just to set things straight, in 2013, more than 200 civil rights, voting rights, and criminal justice organizations wrote the Census Bureau director requesting that it explore alternative ways to count incarcerated people in the upcoming census. That would be the 2020 census we just had. You know, the National Urban League was a signatory to this letter. So that goes hand in hand with what you said about our long interest and history involved in advocacy on this important issue. Then in 2016, the Census Bureau announced plans to continue counting persons who are incarcerated as residents of their prison for the 2020 census. And they said, okay, public, what do y'all think about this? Where nearly 100,000 people, including former directors of the Census Bureau and 13 US senators, weighed in against the Census Bureau's plan to continue this policy. So at the time, I was a senior staff member doing civic engagement work in the Census Director's office when all of this came about. And it really did seem like we were ready to pull the plug on this egregious provision. We were right there, Mark, just like you mentioned. Then the elections came, and that whole piece was dead on arrival. It never happened. But however, as recently as last year, late last year, the Urban League continued its advocacy on this issue by meeting with the Census Bureau's parent organization, the Department of Commerce. We met with Secretary Gina Raimondo and requested an end to prison-based gerrymandering in the 2030 census. And in short, this was in her 2-page letter back to us. It can be summed up in this one sentence. She wrote back and said, the Census Bureau has determined that the practice of counting prisoners at the correctional facility was consistent with the concept of usual residence as established by the Census Act of 1790, which we all know did not count folks and counted some of us as 3/5 of a person. So that's their story, and they're sticking with it, even as recently as 2022. So we've heard about the purpose of this panel. All of the panelists have a deep understanding about what this is all about, and we'd like to now ask some specific questions of them, given the work that they have continued to be doing in their commitment to this issue. So we talked a bit about what is prison gerrymandering and why should we be concerned? Who are the winners? Who are the losers? And what are the overall ramifications? Mark talked a little bit about that. Before we go into individual questions, is there anything else any of the panel members would like to add to that question with respect to winners and losers? Fred, Hillary, or Alex, the door, is there anything that we are missing here?
Well, I'll just add that in our discussion of the winners and losers, we all know that a lot of these areas where prisons are located are a lot of rural areas, not high in concentrations of people of color. And here are representatives, because counting everyone every 10 years, counting people is going to equate to funding and representation. But here in these communities, here are people running for office that they're not going to go to the prisons to get that vote. because there's no such thing unless you're in Maine or somewhere. So that doesn't work. And then the funding that these communities receive, there are some areas that there's a particular case where the elected representative won by 2 votes because 95% of the population in this area was incarcerated. That is not adequate representation of their political power. They shouldn't have that political power. That's power denied from metropolitan areas where a lot of incarcerated individuals will return, large cities, and with resources needed as people get back on their feet, find jobs, job training, what have you. So I think you've covered it all, but we talk a lot about what marginalized communities lose. Sometimes let's talk about what these undeserved communities are gaining, and that's the win.
Thank you so much. And it's really interesting that it's so odd that in these counties that win, they win 2 or 3 times over, because we overcount already persons in those communities. So they're overcounted. They don't look like the people who are, in these communities who are so in need of the resources that they're cheated out of. So I'm going to go to Alex next. So you recently wrote an article entitled "States to the Census Bureau. You created prison gerrymandering. Now you end it." So can you talk a little bit about this? I think you wrote it, I saw it last month, I believe last month. Can you talk a bit about this article, why you wrote it, and the context in which you were trying to get the Census Bureau's attention? What do you want to come out of this? And is anybody listening, Alex?
Yeah, well, luckily, so the article was based on a report from the NCSL. And luckily the Census Bureau does listen to the states via the NCSL. So I think the history behind this article would be a little bit of good background. So first I wrote one a month or 2 earlier that was just based on the official redistricting reports that came out of the states. And what I had originally hoped for that one was more of what ended up with this NCSL one. So what happened this decade is there's been a shift since 2010. Like we talked a little bit about how we were almost there in 2016, going into the 2018 end-to-end test. And there's just so many more states now taking action on their own. And like when Friend mentioned that place where somebody won by 2 votes, that was a city council seat in Anamosa, Iowa. And when that happened, what that city did is they're such a tiny place, they just got rid of their district. They're like, this makes no sense. There aren't any reason to even try to elect people from districts in that case, because everybody has similar interests of the actual residents in town. So you have these places that are already struggling, that are winners in some ways at the state level, but are losers at the local level, where you have all these rural places with prisons that they reject the census counts. So this has been happening already, that rural areas have been, for their own internal redistricting purposes, adjusting the census counts already. So when the states started doing it in after the 2010 census, counting incarcerated people at home, it was then seen as something new, which it totally was at the state level. And when the state reports came out, they went on at length about how they did these adjustments. And it kind of paved the pathway for more states to do it. In the 2020 census, we had about 18 states now that have legislation or policies to count incarcerated people at home through the 2020 census. And so this report from the NCSL was the one that kind of did the deep dive on the particulars of how the adjustment was done. Because at this point, at the state level, it's really seen as no longer kind of a groundbreaking process. And this is the momentum that we've gained over the last 10 years. While we've taken a step back at the Census Bureau, the Bureau listens to the states as the ultimate users of the redistricting data. And that's where really the only spot where they feel answerable to.
Yeah.
So the 100,000 plus comments that they got, obviously they felt like they could ignore that without repercussion. But when now you go to these NCSL meetings, which is the National Council of State Legislatures, where state legislators go, the Census Bureau goes and listens carefully to what they have to say. And when you get a room full of state legislators and redistricting authorities telling the Bureau, look, this data you're giving us for redistricting, it's not good for our purposes, that's really where the Census Bureau starts listening.
I have to tell you, Alex, you're absolutely right. The Census Bureau, I was a senior manager there for 20 years, and they absolutely do listen to the National Conference of State Legislators. That might be its most important stakeholder, bar none. So you're right. It's very interesting that the tide is changing, and that the tail is the Census Bureau back there, way behind the state, some of the states. Excellent work. The name of that report that the National Conference of State Legislators did is, and we can put that up too, Jerica. I think we can put the link to that up. If not, Alex, she can provide it to us. I believe you can provide it to us. It's called the Inmate Data Reallocation in the 2020 Redistricting Cycle. So maybe if they can provide that would be great. The link to that. The next question goes to Fred. Fred and Hillary, both of you work with Southern populations, I believe, many of which have large Black communities. Fred, how has prison-based gerrymandering affected your work in the redistricting process, trying to draw fair and equitable lines? What were some of your toughest challenges in the 2020 census, especially regarding trying to ensure fair political representation in Black communities, particularly?
Thank you, Jerry. And that's an excellent question. The Southern Poverty Law Center, we concentrate on 5 Southern states: Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and Florida. And of course, voting is an issue down there as really anywhere in the United States, but particularly in the South. I'll start off with the greatest challenge for us in 2020 is the education piece. You have to continuously talk about the census. Just like every year, it doesn't matter, it can be an off-election year, we still talk about voter registration. We still talk about get out the vote. We still talk about advocacy. You have to do the same thing with the census. Mm-hmm. There was a pandemic, as everyone knows, so we had to revert to virtual meetings, which was a little different because before the census started, I was so glad to see so many civil rights organizations getting out there, talking about filling out that census form. Don't throw it away, do it. And coupling that with a conversation about voting, they go together. So talk about that. And going around doing it 2018, 2019, and then we know what happened. So we had to still encourage people to get out and count, get out, fill out their forms, make sure they don't just go without being counted, because we have explained and we have to continue to explain why we have to do it. And there are so many challenges, like, why does the government need to know my business? It's nobody's business how many children I have. Yes, it is, because that community your elected representative, if you get someone that fights for you, that elected representative can be fighting for funds for children, for single parents, for job training, for all kinds of things. So it all matters. And we needed to go around and tell people. It's a little easier to do it face to face than on a call, because and we did virtual calls, and I was glad to do them. We had to do them, but you wonder, that person that isn't on screen, if they're really hearing you, when you could be in their presence and walk up to them like I do and get right in their face and say, "Now, tell me what I just said." So it's a little different. So I will say the education piece sort of hampered, but we still did it. We did it virtually. but you all, it may be 2023 now. And if we sit back and go, oh, well, we got 7 years, you really don't have 7 years. You have to continue to do this. So when you're talking about voter registration, when you're talking about decarceration and how many people of color are locked up and what we need to do to decriminalize, we need to throw this conversation in there as well. Because if we're talking about the rights of individuals and rights of individuals once they are released, voting, this is a right. It's not a privilege, it is a right. And being counted is a right. So I want to get formerly incarcerated individuals their voting rights back. I know that's a different conversation, but we got to get them counted because that plays into this whole political process.
Mhm. Thank you for that. You know, we saw that need, the Black Roundtable did, and we reached out to formerly incarcerated individuals. And that doggone COVID thing hit, and the concern there was, we're sorry, we can't focus on the 2020 census because our people are dying in prison cells from COVID. And so, you know, you're right. That was a huge challenge. And thank you. We're not stopping. We're going to keep going. And which brings me to Hillary, who I'd love to speak about some of the ongoing litigation around this issue at the state level, and where is this Supreme Court and all of this? What are the constitutional implications, given what Secretary Raimondo just, you know, I read to you what she said. Hey, this is in the constitutional mandate of the Census Bureau within the guidelines of back in 1790. How does all this fit together, and what's on the horizon? What should we be focusing on right now, Hillary?
Yeah, thanks so much. So my big picture thing that I want to convey is that litigation probably is not the correct avenue, that the kind of advocacy and education that Fred was just talking about and that Alex has been working towards, and others, and your group has also been working towards, that is absolutely, in my opinion, the way to go. And that's because there have been some challenging decisions. The First Circuit Court of Appeals, for example, has a challenging decision on this issue. But when advocacy succeeds and states change their laws, those laws are defended successfully in court. And I want to call out PPI, Alex's group, for being on those litigations and being the one to litigate those. Southern Coalition, I don't think, has specifically litigated a prison gerrymandering case to my knowledge, but for those who have, they have successfully defended those, you know, advocacy wins in court. And what that leads me to think is that advocacy is absolutely the way to go, and that those wins, if the census does change the way that it does this, or if the End Prison Gerrymandering Act that's currently been proposed in this legislative, you know, congressional session, if that is passed, I think, you know, that could be defended successfully in court if it were challenged. So the advocacy is the way to go, and those advocacy wins can be successfully defended in court and upheld. In our own experience, we found that, you know, advocacy is the way to go because once folks in jurisdictions that were impacted by this actually understood it, when they actually understood what was going on, even the representatives who were benefiting, so-called benefiting from this practice, they even had to admit that they thought it was unfair and needed to change. So the example there, as I mentioned earlier, we did this huge advocacy campaign in jurisdictions throughout the South. One of those jurisdictions was Granville County, North Carolina. Granville County, North Carolina is home to the Butner Federal Facility, one of the largest federal facilities in the states and the largest in North Carolina. And that had caused a 40% distortion in the local voting plans. And when we brought that to the attention of the local community, there was an op-ed written, you know, back and forth letter writing, an NPR story from our, you know, or a local press story on it, where they got the county level official who had been benefiting for this, they got him to admit, of course I don't want prison gerrymandering. And lo and behold, the first time in recorded history that we know of, Granville County did not prison gerrymander this year. Now that was a win, but it took so much work to get there. And so these state by state advocacy efforts that PPI and your group is leading, the national advocacy getting the word out, the educational initiatives that Fred just spoke about, where you don't do it just when the census comes up, but you're continually educating the community. Those are all really crucial. And I think they will ultimately prevail. We at SCSJ have teamed up with PPI, a local NC redistricting counts, and the Redistricting Data Hub to develop actually a toolkit, which I'll provide a link for in our chat if I could. This is a toolkit, and we're taking it on the road, and we're going to give presentations and do community outreach in person. I think Fred's point about having to do in person is really important and crucial, especially with community members. And also, start reaching out to folks who have been impacted by this issue to also speak, because I think that's a voice that has not been heard enough in this space, is folks who are formerly incarcerated and talking about their experiences and being counted in a place that they did not feel was their home. So we're working to amplify those voices, do the community advocacy, because I really do think that once people learn and understand this issue, it's undeniable. Just like that commissioner in Granville County, they're going to have to say, well, of course we want to end this practice. And if there is a legislative fix, or the census finally does the right thing, I think they just solicited comments last year or the year before on this again, but I don't know if they've issued a decision for 2030.
No.
If they finally come around, I really think those advocacy wins will be defended well in court if they are challenged, and it'll be hopefully put the matter to rest.
Wow. Well, thank you for that. I'm a DC resident, so I live up south, as you could say. And we don't have statehood. So I'm just listening to y'all talk, and I'm thinking, wow, it sure would be good to have statehood here in DC. We don't have any senators or anything. But I did want to mention that this provision is so extensive in terms of how deep it cuts into our communities, because the Census Bureau even counts juveniles who are in detention facilities outside of their home jurisdictions, which I just find startling that, they're that thorough, and this is, that they would also include juveniles who were detained in facilities outside of their home environments. However, not to be outdone, if you just happen to be in a boarding school, you could count it in your home jurisdiction. If I'm not mistaken, the Census Bureau recently, I think in its most recent residence criteria, allowed kids who are in residential boarding schools to be counted, not at the facility of the boarding school, but in their home jurisdiction. So you all can fact check me on that, but it just really got to me a little bit. So we can either, we should ask the audience now if they have any questions. Jerica, would you pose that to our illustrious folk out there who are listening to this conversation?
Absolutely. If you have a question for any of our speakers, please feel free to drop it in the chat or raise your hand. I see we have a question from Janine Abrams McLean.
Hi, everybody. This was such a wonderful, can y'all hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
This was such a wonderful panel. And I think just asking for folks that have been involved and also some of the new folks that are on, what are like the top 2-3 things that advocacy groups can do to really push this, especially at the state level and at, of course, the national level? What are like the top 3 things, call to action, that you would like us to do?
I'll start first by saying continuing talks and discussions just like this. We have to continue educating about the census. Doesn't matter that it's 7 years off, and about prison gerrymandering and redistricting. The manner in which a district is drawn has a lot to do with who gets elected from that district, as we all know. And the issue with prison gerrymandering, if we just keep hammering it, again, as Alex and others have said, it'll make sense to people, and it'll be hard to justify why a small rural community has so much political power compared to cities not very far away that don't have prisons and don't have that same type of representation. So we've got to continue doing that. And redistricting isn't over. There are suits out there, as everyone has mentioned here. There will be more suits because now we live in an age when elected representatives don't like the outcome of an election. We know a lot of things come out of that other than newer suppressive laws. They engage in mid-decade redistricting. Georgia did it around 2016 or attempted to do it, and others will. When these elections are a little too close and someone wins that wasn't supposed to win, or it's just the outcome was just a little too close for comfort, these legislators, particularly in the South, they'll just change them. They'll just go in and do redistricting again, and we'll hear about it. And while we're hearing about it, while all of these groups like Fair Count and all of us, Urban League, everyone is out there doing this work, we've got to continue teaching, because when you go to these hearings and you're uninformed and you look at a district and you say, oh, wow, I'm okay, that district's 52% Black population or Latino population, we should be okay. But if you haven't attended these kinds of sessions to understand, wait a minute, there's a prison there with thousands of people, those people can't vote, I need to take that number out of that voting age population and then recalculate what that percentage is, then demographers like me and others on this call have to go, that district may not be electable. It may not allow people of color an equal opportunity to elect a candidate of choice. So we've got to continue educating, just continue until everyone knows so much about prison gerrymandering and census like the back of their hand. That's just, and I think that's important, and it's something we never do too much of.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. Any other questions?
Hi, yeah, I had a quick question. I should turn my camera on. Can you guys hear me all right?
We can hear you, Charles.
Hello. So I had a question about how initiatives for these sorts of reforms play into prisoner enfranchisement initiatives. I wonder if those are best done, in tandem, or if it's best to focus on prison gerrymandering and then not focus on getting prisoners to vote at the same time. I wonder how those play into each other, if they actually do at all.
So who would like to answer that question?
I could take a crack at it. Yeah, so they're definitely completely separate issues. One is about voting and equal access to voting. The other is about representation. And where I think it's useful to keep each issue in mind while working on the other is because at times you run against issues of or definitions of residence that might seem to be working at cross purposes if you're only taking one issue at a time. So for example, in reenfranchisement or even just access to voting, oftentimes folks who are incarcerated who don't have a stable address they can provide outside of a jail, for example, or if it's easier for them to vote from the location of the prison, will oftentimes rely on being able to register to vote with the correctional facility location, and then change their registration when they can get somewhere stable once they leave. And that is obviously on its face at cross purposes with the residence rules that we're relying on the Census Bureau, which is your usual place of residence being your home. Your domicile doesn't change when you go to prison, which is the law in nearly every state. Is your residence for voting purposes remains at the location where you lived prior to prison. So if you get the right to vote, even if you're in prison in Vermont and Maine, you're required to vote by absentee ballot. But as a practical matter, some folks who are incarcerated prefer to vote from the facility address. And where there's now efforts to have jail voting with a polling place in the jail, oftentimes it's easier for folks to vote from that precinct. So it's important to keep both in mind and to do the work in a way that efforts at ending prison gerrymandering don't hamper efforts to restore people's voting rights and vice versa. Oh, and just the way that usually gets resolved is that the number of folks who want to use the jail address are usually quite small. So it ends up being it ends up having no practical impact on the redistricting numbers, but it's just an issue to be aware of.
Very well. Jerica?
Yes, thank you so much for that. I do want to encourage folks, if there are additional conversations, to feel free to reach out directly to Ioma Iruka or myself, who you may have received invitations for this convening from. I would like to go to the Washington Bureau shortly, but before I do, I just want to go back to you, Jerry, to see if you have any updates for the roundtable. I know that there was the Census Bureau had their National Advisory Committee on Race and Ethnicity. They held its spring meeting last month. Are there any important updates from that meeting that you want to share for the roundtable, or anything else that's pertinent before we go over to the Washington Bureau for their update?
Okay, very well. I'll be very quick because we're running out of time, but I did want to go back to last April, the National Urban League was instrumental in getting a 2-week extension from the Office of Management and Budget, OMB, on their April 17th deadline for public comments on its plan to revise race and ethnicity standards for federal agencies. Central to OMB's proposal is a Census Bureau's plan to combine the current Hispanic origin question that was on the 2020 census form, which would, as the plan goes, eliminate the need for Hispanic respondents to also check a race category when answering the census. As we know, Hispanics are an ethnicity and can be of any race. However, with this new proposal that OMB is considering on behalf of the Census Bureau, Hispanics would be no longer required to check a race box. At the same time, the Census Bureau proposes to establish a Middle Eastern and Northern African MENA category so that those respondents would no longer be counted as white in the census as currently practiced. So I know if this passes, Fred, you're going to have your hands full as it relates to drawing lines and so forth. So as a part of that deadline, the National Urban League and the National Coalition on Black Civic Participation spearheaded a joint meeting with OMB and certain selected stakeholders to address our concerns about the Census Bureau's plans with respect to the race and ethnicity question. Particularly, we wanted to know, what kind of impact is this going to be on the overall Black count? How are you going to count Black immigrants? And we heard loudly from Afro-Latinos who told us they thought that this proposal would be unfair and that they would be missed and their needs would be missed in a broader Hispanic count. So we've been working on that issue. The NAC certainly took this issue up. The National Advisory Committee, our member, a member of this roundtable committee, Julio Guiti Guevara, was the only person on the committee who said, no, this is not going to work for us. So we're against this provision, even though the Census Bureau's advisory committee moved forward with passing it. Similarly, the National Urban League members, Janine Abrams McLean and Ioma, who also sit on the National Advisory Committee, emphasized that race still matters in America and that the Census Bureau should not conflate race with ethnicity, nor diminish the role of race in the Census Bureau's count of people. So we're scheduling a follow-up meeting on that with OMB before they make a final decision. You can see the National Urban League's comments of this proposal, as well as the minutes from the National Advisory Committee meeting. I think we're going to post a link to that. And then finally, I just want to say that in light of some of the discussion we had, the Census Bureau recently announced last month that it will not change some 2020 census population estimates challenged by the city of Detroit, among several other cities. Detroit filed a lawsuit last September claiming that the Census Bureau miscounted residents twice, first underreporting the city's total population, then missing some residents who lived in group settings, like in dorms, prisons, and nursing homes. So Detroit won its challenge over group quarters, adding an additional 1,400 people to the city's total, but the Census Bureau rejected any change to Detroit's overall population estimate. The 1,400 people that they missed were those individuals who lived in group quarters, including prisons, which the Census Bureau did a pretty lousy job counting correctly. And I should mention that in a separate challenge by another locality, Milwaukee, it won its claim that more than 800 incarcerated individuals were missed. So far, 100 cities and jurisdictions have challenged their 2020 census counts, and they're not getting a lot of leeway from the Census Bureau on shifting those numbers. But Milwaukee did, because of the inadequacies in the counting of persons who are incarcerated, did win an additional 800 individuals into their count. And I'll stop here. There's plenty more to say, but we better move on in the interest of time.
Thank you, Jerry. And clearly from your update and from the conversation at hand, there is continued engagement that is needed by this roundtable and all of our partners. Now I'd like to turn the floor over to my colleague, Yvette Badanumako, who is the Interim Executive Director and the Vice President of Policy in the National Urban League's Washington Bureau. Yvette?
Thanks, Jerica. There's been activity in both Congress and the executive branch around the census. First, in April of this year, Congresswoman Deborah Ross reintroduced the End Prison Gerrymandering Act. The bill currently only has 9 co-sponsors, all of whom are Democrats, but we do think it's likely to gain additional support. And if passed, beginning in the 2030 census, the next census, the Bureau would have to count people who are incarcerated in their last place of residence before incarceration, rather than in the location where they are jailed. And on the appropriations front, the National Urban League joined a census project letter urging Congress to provide $2 billion in funding for the Census Bureau. And that represents a $394 million increase above the president's request and a $521 million increase from the agency's fiscal year 2023 enacted level. And when it comes to appropriations right now, only 4 subcommittees have held appropriations bill markups in May, but none of them have the census within their jurisdiction. So we are expecting that full committee markups and additional subcommittee markups are expected to be announced soon. So we will keep you updated on whether the CJS, which covers the census, does get scheduled. In May, as Jerry mentioned earlier in the discussion, the National Urban League sent a letter to the Census Bureau to advocate for more Black representation in its ranks. As you all know, there are 2 primary advisory bodies for the 2030 census. First is the National Advisory Committee, the NAC, which is responsible for advising the Census Bureau on research, design, and the planning around the 2030 census. And then there's also the Census Scientific Advisory Committee, which really provides the technical expertise to the Bureau. The Bureau is clearly lacking significant Black representation in both these committees and in senior positions within the Bureau. And the National Urban League is working to ensure that the Bureau is paying attention to diverse representation in planning. And we've also shared this feedback with the Congressional Black Caucus so that they can press on this issue behind the scenes. And speaking of the Congressional Black Caucus, we're also working closely with them in the run-up to submitting our comments on how the census will update its counting methods in future surveys. As you know, as Jerry mentioned as well, the census sought feedback on a plan to combine the race question and the ethnicity question in the future. And after prodding from advocates, OMB provided a Hill briefing that the Congressional Black Caucus attended. Turns out the Congressional Black Caucus ultimately decided not to submit comments due to the various internal constituencies that the caucus serves, as they serve both the Black community and the Afro-Latino community. So National Urban League submitted feedback on the issue, urging the Bureau to avoid defining Black too narrowly, was shared with the Congressional Black Caucus, and they are continuing to review the issue. Thank you. And with that, I will turn it back to Jerica.
Thank you, Yvette. And thank you to all of our speakers who have joined us. Thank you to all of the members of the movement and the roundtable who have tuned in this afternoon. Obviously, there is much work to be done. The 2030 census will be right around the corner, and it's important that we continue engaging on these issues. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to our President and CEO, Mark Morial, to close us out.
Hey, Jerica, thank you very much. Yvette, thank you very much to Jerry and everyone who's had a chance to present today, as well as all of you who participated. Thank you very much. I think, Fred, you said it. We have to continue the conversation publicly about this issue. We have to educate people about the unfairness of this issue. All of this is part of the poisonous tree of the prison industrial complex, poisonous tree of mass incarceration, which has many fruits and many vines and many branches that at the end of the day suppress our power at a time when voter suppression is rampant across the nation. Hundreds of bills, rhetoric, false arguments being made across the nation. This fits right into that narrative to suppress our ability to maximize our power in this democratic system. So we will continue to fight, and we will continue to fight until hell freezes over, and then we will fight on the ice. So let's continue. Thank you for joining us, and until the next meeting of the roundtable, thank you, Melanie Campbell, for being a great co-convener. Thank you, everyone. Let's move ahead. Take care. Have a fantastic day.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.